Hello and welcome to the 8th of several online panel discussions with foster parents and experts that we're calling The Arena. Foster Source is partnering with the Colorado Department of Human Services to bring you this series as an opportunity to connect, share real stories and struggles, and proactively seek support. I'm your host, Renee Bernhardt. I'm a former foster parent and I'm an adoptive parent in Adams County. My husband and I are the founders, and I am the director of Foster Source, a nonprofit that serves foster and kinship families statewide in Colorado. At Foster Source, we provide trauma-informed education, relief services like bunk beds, mattresses, car seats, and weighted items, and therapeutic services like mental health therapy and equine-assisted parenting practice labs. I'm happy to be with you today. In today's episode of The Arena, we'll be discussing what foster parents need to know about mental health, both for themselves and for the children in their care. May is both Mental Health Awareness Month and Foster Care Awareness Month, which makes it the perfect time to dig into this important topic with our guest experts today. First, I would like to introduce you to Sherry Simmons. As a 30-year career therapist, Sherry offers individual, couples, and family teletherapy sessions that focus on rediscovering, meaning exploring what is and isn't working, rewinding, acknowledging past wounds, reimagining, feeling and creating new beliefs, and rebuilding, implementing action steps. Sherry has been a foster parent herself, and nearly 80% of the families that Sherry works with are foster, adoptive, and kinship families. Sherry also has experience running mental health facilities and developing trainings for professionals. Welcome, Sherry.
Thank you.
Next, I would like to introduce Dave Weiner. Dave is the co-founder of Groundwork Ranch in Louisville. Groundwork Ranch is a nonprofit organization that provides equine-assisted learning programs specifically designed to empower and engage at-risk teens and foster and kinship parents who care for children and youth who have experienced trauma. Dave is a national certified counselor, a certified clinical trauma professional, and a certified grief counseling specialist. In addition to his work at Groundwork Ranch, Dave has a private practice called A Path Forward Counseling, where he offers office-based and equine-assisted counseling, specializing in helping people turn post-traumatic distress into post-traumatic success. Dave has experience providing therapy to foster parents and kinship caregivers and is also a former foster parent. So let's dig right in. One question you both mentioned you received often is, why is trauma-informed therapy important for children in foster care, for young people who have experienced foster care, as well as for foster parents? Sherry, why is it important?
There are two reasons. The first is to really understand what is going on with the kids in your care, what their triggers are, what resiliency looks like for them, how to teach them to adapt to the world that they're in now. It's also important for you as the foster parent or the kinship provider to learn your own triggers, to learn how to emotionally regulate yourself when dealing with all that comes with fostering. Because really, we as foster parents experience emotions all along the spectrum. And so it's our job to be the strongest nervous system in the room. And we do that by understanding what our own triggers are.
Absolutely. Dave, why would you say it's important?
Well, I agree with everything that Sherry just said. I would add that our kiddos' nervous systems are in near constant threat response mode. So they need to learn resources to help regulate their nervous systems. Therapy for foster kiddos probably is not, at least for a lot of them, sit on the couch and tell me about your past. Because they just don't have access to the words. They don't have access to that part of their brain. So I believe that for the kiddos, the trauma-informed therapy has to be more somatically based, more art-based, more expression, equine-based, ways to help them get in touch with their nervous systems before we can ask them to really process the emotions or the thoughts. And then for foster parents, I also agree with everything that Sherry said. I think it's really common and really misunderstood, not talked enough about how traumatizing being a foster parent can be. Not just the vicarious trauma of all the stuff that we hear about, that we witness, but the firsthand trauma of someone collapsing in our arms weeping because of a visitation that just happened. These can all trigger not just our own trauma memories from our life, but real firsthand in the moment traumatic situations. And we need a place to process that, to be seen, to be validated. And therapy is a great place for both the kiddos and the adults to get that.
Absolutely. Sherry, you mentioned that in the past few years, there have been increasing opportunities and increased emphasis on foster parents working more closely with bio families and kinship caregivers. Why is working with bio families important? And how can foster parents work closely with biological parents and other family members, as well as the kids in care and the professionals, in a way that sets and maintains healthy boundaries?
That's a good question. You know, some of the work that I do with the foster parents is really helping them drill down and get a perspective from everyone's worldview, okay? So if there's a situation that's difficult, how might the child view it? How might the caseworker be feeling? What about the bio parent? What might they be feeling? And really get a little bit of distance from the issue or the problem and view it from everyone's lenses can often soften our own responses. I talk to parents quite a bit about how to set healthy boundaries. You know, we teach people how to treat us. And so there's a difference between a loose boundary that might sound like we need to play nice in the sandbox together, right? That's too loose and can be interpreted several different ways. Versus a hard boundary, maybe a harsh boundary, which can sound like, I need this kiddo back at 6 o'clock sharp, and if I don't, I'm going to call the caseworker and complain. Versus a healthy boundary, which might sound something like, you know, we all have important schedules to honor. I'd like to ask you to be back on time so that I can get your child back into their routine and into bed at a healthy time frame. Does that work for you? I mean, that's more of a healthy way of establishing a relationship with a bio parent.
And so important, right? I think it was Boulder County that asked us specifically for a training on setting boundaries. And you designed that training for us. Are you bound by a lack of boundaries? And when you say it, it seems pretty self-explanatory, right? Like, of course, that sounds better. But I feel like in that moment, we aren't necessarily thinking that way. So it is helpful to really dig into that a little bit. Dave, I'm wondering from you, if you have any books or articles that you would recommend to foster parents about caregiving, about kinship placement, and the long-term impacts for children who are able to keep a strong bond with their families.
There's countless books that have been written about those subjects. But to be honest, the subject that is, I think, a broader, more, maybe not more, equally important topic is for parents to understand trauma, their own and their children's. The book that I recommend everyone read, not just foster parents, I think everyone on the planet should read it, but particularly people who are supporting kids who have experienced trauma. It's called The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. I think it's one of the foundational books about modern understanding of what trauma does, not just to kiddos, but to human beings, because that gets back to, I think, taking the perspective of the child, understanding what their experience has left them with. Not necessarily left them limited by, but left them with. Because that's where it starts. That's where success in a placement or success with reunification begins. So that's my number one book on my reading list.
I agree completely. And it ties back to what you mentioned earlier about children not having the words to do a traditional talk therapy. That is because a lot of their trauma happens in utero or in really early childhood. And a lot of times we hear, well, they don't remember, but like you just said, the body keeps the score. So I agree that book is so important. The other book that I always recommend everyone read is a book called Which Way? Sherry, will you tell us a little bit about that book?
Oh, I wrote that book with my mother, actually. It's her very traumatic story in growing up in the system, turned triumphant. So it's her memoir and my coming in on each chapter, explaining what was happening in the brain at the time.
You can also find an incredible TED Talk that Sherry and her mom Jan do about obviously similar topics. Thank you both. Why is it important for foster parents to be able to look at things from the perspective of others involved, such as the caseworker, the child, or the biological family members? Sherry, will you start us there?
You know, the experience of fostering is bigger than just us. The biological parent has had an experience, the child has an experience and is often in the middle. The caseworker has their own experience and mandates that they have to follow. So I think it's important to step back, like I said earlier, and take a look at what everyone's perspective might be in a given situation. That allows us to distance ourselves enough from it to view the lens that all these other parties might be seeing things from. It can help us formulate a response instead of a reaction. It can help us, like I said, be firm in our own boundaries while being compassionate at the same time.
I agree completely. As a new foster parent who didn't know any better, I spent a lot of my time judging the birth parents. And it was once I knocked that wall down that I was really able to have a really tender and vulnerable relationship with the birth family, and it changed the whole trajectory of the case. I wish I had had that from the beginning. But now I know better. Dave, I think for a lot of foster parents, it's hard to look at the perspective of the caseworker. Why is that important?
Well, I agree. It's very easy, guilty of this myself, to have adversarial feelings toward the caseworker, because the foster parent can really feel like they're on the receiving end of seemingly random requirements or seemingly endless meetings and evaluations and stipulations. I think it's really natural to feel that. I also think it's really important to remember that this is a team sport and that we are all on the same team. We're on the child's team. We all come at this, we all play different positions on the field, but the goal is the same. We can take different perspectives. We can take the caseworker's perspective. We don't have to agree with the caseworker. We don't have to agree with how the law is written or how the system is run. But we do have to remember that being adversarial doesn't help the child at all. In fact, it only complicates things. Having some empathy for the caseworkers is really important. We know that our job is really, really difficult, and we're living with the child 24/7. But we don't have 48 children that we're tracking, or 60 children, 60 open cases. We just have to have a little bit of empathy that they are professionals, they are trained, and they are also human beings who need to sleep and who need to have life outside of their work. Not always easy
Absolutely.
to do, but that's an important perspective to take.
I agree. And who also carry vicarious trauma and secondary trauma with them, just like we do as caregivers. Thanks, Dave. Sherry, you mentioned that getting into power struggles with children and youth can be an easy trap to fall into. What tools and strategies do you provide for disengaging and helping to emotionally regulate yourself so that you can help to regulate the young person that you're caring for?
You know, children live, like Dave said, in their survival brain. Their prefrontal lobe isn't developed yet, so they live in their survival brain. And because of that, their behavior is their language. So they will often act out what they can't verbally express. It often comes in the form of a power struggle. They're wanting to kind of engage us in the same dance routine that, hey, I've done it before, that we often get caught up in. Your job as a foster parent or kinship parent is not to completely redo the whole dance. It's simply to take one step different. And that one step different might look like you delaying whatever it is that you're wanting to say. So it might sound like, I'm about to lose it here. I need to tap out and take a time out until I can calm down, and we'll discuss this again later. Or there will be consequences, but I'm too angry to talk to you about them right now. So I'm gonna go have some self-care, and we'll talk again later tonight. It might look like you disengaging and connecting with yourself to regulate your own central nervous system so that you can then engage in a conversation with the kiddo that's responsive instead of reactive.
Yes, absolutely. Dave, what about those unexpected trauma triggers that just come up for kids, seemingly out of the blue? How can we navigate those?
So first and foremost, when I'm witnessing an unexpected trigger, is for me to check in with myself. Let me take some deep breaths. Let me stay regulated, because that's going to contage my emotions and my nervous system response to my child. That's not the end of the situation, but that's the important beginning. I can take some of the steam out of my child's threat response. What do I do next? If possible, I would step back from the trigger, disengage from the trigger. When they are already triggered, that's not the time to try to desensitize them, to try to use exposure therapy, you can't, there's that saying, you can't teach a kid to swim while he's drowning. So if they're triggered, regulate myself, step back from the trigger, bringing the child with me, and then validate. That's still not the time to try to get into this lengthy intellectual conversation about why that siren shouldn't be triggering because we just happen to live near a hospital. That's not, giving that rational perspective still isn't the time, because they're still in their trauma response or their threat response. So I believe one of the most powerful ways to minimize, to ratchet down that threat response is to feel seen, is to feel like, okay, I've got my people around me, I am safe. How do we do that as parents? We validate, we name the emotion that we see. You must be so scared right now, you must be so angry. Not trying to argue with the emotion, just let them know that we see them. Next step, I think, would be to guide them through exercises to ratchet down their nervous system. Still not talking about the trigger itself. We're talking about the reaction to the trigger. Deep breathing, progressive muscle relaxation, large muscle movements like jumping jacks or push-ups or proprioceptive weight-bearing exercises. These are all ways that our nervous system can downregulate and therefore downregulate our physical experience of that trigger. Only then would I think it be time to circle back, once that trigger is resolved, to circle back and discuss it. And the good news is, now we won't be surprised by that trigger next time. Now we have an opportunity to more intentionally and in a regulated state begin the process of desensitizing to that trigger. Foster parenting, I believe, is a constant exploration, a constant journey of discovering those triggers, dealing with them in the moment, then coming back and saying, okay, now that we know it, let's work to overcome it.
Yeah, I love how you and Sherry both talked about stepping back and taking a break before engaging. And I think a lot of times as foster parents, we feel like we have to solve it now in the moment. But boy, what a difference it makes to just step back for a second. Thank you, Dave. But Sherry, you talked about connection before correction, which makes so much sense. Can you give us some tools or resources for being compassionate and firm at the same time? We still need them to do what we need them to do. So how can we show compassion and still get done what needs to be done?
Yeah, I do a talk called Connection Before Correction. I remind myself of it all throughout the day as just a human being. The reason that statement is powerful is because when we connect with ourselves first, all right, and what that looks like is maybe stepping away, maybe taking some deep breaths. I've got one foster parent that grabs 2 ice cubes and in her hands, and when they're melted, her brain is back online again. Connection often looks like just stepping away. It often looks like calling a friend and saying, I'm about to lose it. Talk me off the ledge here. Connecting with your parenting partner. Going in the other room and listening to some music that can soothe you a bit. Taking a walk. Feeling the sun on you. I mean, all of those are ways to connect with yourself first. And so that you can go back and connect with the kiddo. And wow, that was a lot of emotion. You must feel angry right now or lost right now. And if the kiddo says, I don't feel that, I feel blah, blah, blah. Great, go with it. Okay, you feel blah, blah, blah. That's a lot of emotion. I imagine you must feel da, 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 da. And you've got a dialogue going then. You're connecting with the kiddo. Then you can circle back around and give the consequence. Now, we need to talk about you just destroying this room. And how are we going to get this, what's your plan to get this cleaned up? You see how that's a different response than, what did you do, blah, 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 which never ends well.
Absolutely. Well, and I think it's validating for me and for other foster parents to hear that happens to everyone, right? We sometimes think the foster parents who are doing it right aren't frustrated and don't feel like they're going to lose it. That's not the case. Everyone gets there, but it's recognizing it and then taking those steps to kind of mitigate that before it turns into an eruption. Thank you, Sherry. Dave, I want to talk to you about a tougher subject. You mentioned it can be hard for foster parents to admit that a placement is not working. And it's not working for them, it's not working for the children or the youth in their home. I want to talk to you about the advice you'd give foster parents when a placement isn't working out. For example, if a placement does disrupt, we know that causes more trauma for the child. That's why at Foster Source, we work to keep placements stable and maintain placements, but sometimes it just doesn't work. How do you coach foster parents through those feelings of failure and guilt around disruptions?
I experienced this myself, and yes, it's really hard to acknowledge the idea that I have just added another attachment wound to this child's life. It's a horrible feeling. So first and foremost, let's validate that sometimes ending a placement is in the child's best interest and or the foster family's best interest. It does happen. It is not a character flaw of the foster parent. It's also not a character flaw of the child. It's a mismatch of needs and resources. I think it's really important for foster parents to reflect on the difference between guilt and regret. Guilt to me implies a blame. I'm to blame for this. It's my fault. I failed. Regret, on the other hand, is the emotion of wishing it were different, or sadness that this happened. I think separating those two things is a big step. I also think that the foster parent needs to give themselves an opportunity to grieve. Yes, there are feelings of regret. Yes, there are probably feelings and experiences of trauma that the foster parent does need to work through. And there is grief. But grief over the loss of my expectations, the loss of my dream, the loss of the fairy tale fostering experience that I'm going to be this role of, or this source of comfort and good in this child's life, and I'm going to completely change this child's life. I think grieving that is really important, but also acknowledging the good that the foster parent has done and the intent that they went into the relationship with. There was no intent to harm, so there's no guilt involved, or there's no blame involved. There was an intent to show love, to show compassion, and even though it doesn't feel like it in the moment, chances are really high that the foster parent did provide that. You know, they might not have gotten the ball across the end zone, but they sure took it down the field. They did good work. They planted seeds that they might not have seen sprout, but I'm a firm believer that every positive interaction with an adult, with a loving, caring, trauma-informed adult, plants a seed, plants a reminder in the child's mind that the whole world's not dangerous and every adult isn't a threat.
I love that. Yeah, that's absolutely right. Thank you, Dave. Sherry, you mentioned earlier about how important it is to find a support circle, find connection with other caregivers. And this is something that at Foster Source we're really passionate about because we've seen what happens when you connect with someone who is walking the same path that you are. Walk us through why that is, why that's so helpful for foster parents.
You know, when you're involved in the world of foster care, it is helpful to have people in your life who have no idea what you're talking about, because they often offer a real objective point of view. However, it is imperative that you have people who do get it, who can resonate with the feeling and the circumstances that you may be going through, who can say, I get it, let me tell you what I did. So that support system is imperative when you're doing fostering. You know, self-care in general is imperative when you're fostering, because there is no other way to stay regulated yourself unless you are doing the little things throughout the day to keep yourself emotionally regulated. You know, I often say in my talks that if you can go for an hour workout every day, great for you. But that's not exactly what I'm talking about when I'm talking about self-care. It's the little things throughout the day. It's the, I'm losing it and I'm starting to recognize that in myself. I'm going to step away and take 10 deep breaths. I'm going to make sure I have lunch today. I'm going to make sure I'm keeping hydrated and, moving around and doing the things that help me feel filled up throughout the day, so that when the crisis comes, and we all know it will, we have already done things throughout the day to take care of ourselves. I often have foster parents either write down in their day planner or program into their phones an alarm that goes off that will ask the question, what does self-care look like right now? To remind us that it's the little things throughout the day that keep us regulated. And believe me, when you start to do that as a foster parent, your child will take notice and start to watch and notice what you're doing to take care of yourself, and they'll take that on for themselves. It's a teaching tool for them.
For sure. I think you're absolutely right. We often feel like self-care has to be a bath for 90 minutes where we reset, but it's really more, which is great. That is great self-care if that works for you. But those little resets throughout the day are really powerful as well. Thank you, Sherry. Dave, what would you tell a caregiver struggling with self-care?
I would tell them self-care is not optional. It's also not selfish. There is so much wisdom in the cliche, you can't pour from an empty cup. And self-care is about filling up the cup. I think one thing that's not talked a whole lot about in self-care is the role that self-talk has to play in self-care. It doesn't have to be the 90-minute bath or the 8 hours on the golf course or whatever. Those are great, but self-talk is a foundational element of how I think about myself, how I care for myself, how I value myself. If I'm a foster parent and I am constantly telling myself, oh man, I'm so stupid, how come I didn't see that? That's going to have an effect on my nervous system and on my emotions and therefore on my interactions with my child. Similarly, self-talk about the system, about my caseworker, about my GAL, about the bio-parent, if I'm talking to myself in negative, toxic terms about the experience of foster parenting, or even about my child's behavior, that's also going to have a significant impact. I'm not suggesting we have to be Pollyanna and try to be this toxically positive person, but just be aware of the words we use to talk to ourselves. That's an important aspect of self-care.
I appreciate you both sharing your expertise today, and I've loved having you on the panel. Your advice is so helpful for so many foster parents and children in care who might be navigating their own mental health challenges. Thank you so much for being with us today. If you are a foster or kinship caregiver in Colorado and would like to be matched with a mental health provider sponsored by FosterSource, simply fill out the form at fostersource.org/portal. If you are interested in learning more about foster care in Colorado, visit coforkids.org for more information and to request follow-up from county departments or child placement agencies near you. You can also find more information about trainings and support on our support and training page. Thank you for being with us. See you next time when we learn about how to be affirming adults for LGBTQ+ kids in care.